Imagine waking up tomorrow and seeing that gasoline prices have multiplied overnight. Factories start shutting down one by one. No new smartphones are being produced, and even food prices begin to rise. All of this just because of the closure of a 39-kilometer waterway on the world map. What is this route called? The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strip between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, but one of the most important economic arteries in the world.
These days, we've realized that the world's most critical economic choke point is the Strait of Hormuz, a bottleneck between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And its widest point, this strait is about 39 kilometers wide, which is extremely narrow for a waterway that handles ocean-going supertankers. Let's start from the oceans of the Earth. As you know, more than 70% of the planet is covered by water, which means global trade is heavily dependent on sea routes. That is why even today, around 80% of global transportation and trade is carried out by ships and vessels. At any given time, between 100,000 and 300,000 ships are moving across the world's waters.
The most important type of transportation taking place across the world's waters today is the shipment of oil and petroleum products. The world's oceans are vast and seem endless, but in some places these wide waters narrow into straits whose openness is extremely important. There are many important straits in the world, such as the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, but none of them have as much impact on the global economy as the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz lies between Iran and Oman, and in principle, it should be controlled by these two countries. However, since the British left the Persian Gulf region, Iran has controlled this strait. But now, what is the importance of these straits? A few years ago, a container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and blocked this waterway for several days. During those few days that the route was closed, it caused tens of billions of dollars in losses to the global economy. But the Strait of Hormuz is something else entirely. It is like the main artery in the human neck.
So why is the Strait of Hormuz so important? This strait connects the Persian Gulf through the Gulf of Oman to the Indian Ocean. The Persian Gulf is the most important part of this region, with 8 countries surrounding it: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. For 4 of the Persian Gulf countries, their only access to open waters is through the Strait of Hormuz: Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar. The Earth consumes about 100 million barrels of oil every day. Around 21% of the world's oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz each day. That means out of every 5 barrels of oil consumed in the world, 1 passes through this strait. Beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf and the lands surrounding it lie more than 50% of the world's oil reserves. And as you know, oil cannot be produced just anywhere. It has to be extracted where it is actually found. Alongside the oil reserves located here, the world's largest natural gas reserves are also found in this region. 40% of the world's natural gas lies beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, and the largest of these reserves is the South Pars field, which is shared between Iran and Qatar. I think by now we can understand how important this 39-kilometer strait is for the world, because if the Suez Canal were to be closed, ships could still go around southern Africa via the Cape of Good Hope, but the Strait of Hormuz has no real alternative route. Saudi Arabia has built a pipeline from the shores of the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea to reduce its dependence on passing through this strait, but it still cannot transfer all of its production that way and remains dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. Similarly, the United Arab Emirates has built a pipeline from the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, but that route is also not very effective because these countries want to keep extraction costs as low as possible in order to remain profitable.
Now let's take a closer look at the strait itself. It's true that we said the Strait of Hormuz is 39 kilometers wide, but not all of this width can be used by supertankers and other ships. They have to pass through the deepest part, which enters the territorial waters of Iran and then turns southward. All the islands around this narrow passage are also considered part of Iran's territory. That is why the United Arab Emirates has made many efforts to take those 3 islands from Iran. However, it has not succeeded so far, and those islands are still under Iran's control. In simple terms, the width of the shipping corridor inside the strait is only about 2.5 kilometers.
Sometimes, when storms occur in the surrounding land areas near the strait, desert sands are lifted into the air and the entire strait becomes dark. This significantly reduces the visibility of ships and increases the risk of collisions. At other times, the area becomes covered with heavy fog. That's why ship captains always stay on high alert when they reach this region, to make sure they pass through it safely.
At different times, oil from the Persian Gulf has been shipped to different parts of the world. At one time, most of it went to the United States, and at another time, most of it went to Europe. But today, the growth of China, South Korea, and Japan has caused a large share of this oil to be directed toward East Asia. For example, about 45% of China's oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz. But Japan's situation is even more serious, because around 65% of its oil and gas passes through this strait. South Korea is in a situation similar to Japan. That means if the Strait of Hormuz were to be closed, the greatest pressure would fall on these three countries.
Years ago, experts warned that if the Strait of Hormuz were to be closed, at first it might seem like a small shock, but this small shock would be like an avalanche. As time passes, it would grow larger and faster and cause more damage. Some people think that if oil and gas supplies decrease, it would only make gasoline and diesel more expensive, but these are the simplest consequences. When oil and gas are unavailable or become very expensive, industries around the world begin to shut down one by one because it is no longer profitable for them to continue operating. If this strait is not reopened soon, the global economy would move toward paralysis, famine would begin to appear, car production would rapidly decline, and many other things you can imagine would be affected, even computer components.
For example, the world's largest microchip manufacturing factories, located in Taiwan, depend on liquefied natural gas from Qatar, which currently cannot reach them. And if these chips are not produced, then nothing related to today's technology can be manufactured, meaning smartphones, computers, and cars cannot be produced, and neither can many other things such as televisions, refrigerators, ovens, everything.
On the other hand, global agriculture also depends on the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because 33% of the world's chemical fertilizers are produced from natural gas by Qatar and Iran, and they must pass through this strait. Other materials also pass through this strait as well, for example, petrochemical products. Much of the world's plastic depends on raw materials that pass through here. Another problem caused by the closure of the strait would be famine in the countries of the southern Persian Gulf region, because most of the food supplies of the southern Persian Gulf countries are imported through this strait.
So the main question is this: if the Strait of Hormuz were to be closed, which countries would suffer the most, and which country would gain the most power?